started. So while I'm doing this, just to kind of get a beat on people and, how long you guys have been doing product design. If you've been doing product design for about, or product or UX design for like a year or less, could you use like the thumbs up emoji? And if you've been doing it a year or more, could you use like the heart emoji? I just want to get kind of a beat on where you guys are at. Okay, you got a good mix. Some people. Let's see here, I'm looking through the different numbers. Okay, cool. So we have a good mix of different people from different experience levels here. So I'm going to be jumping into like some of my personal experience doing collaboration as a part of design, and where that kind of fits in with some of the things that we call like value proposition. And trying to find the right ways to talk to different people who may have different experiences with you in your organization. So if you're working with product managers or engineers or documentation people, why is that so important to you? Why do you need to know that as a product designer or UX designer? And where does that fit in with your value in something like research, right? Or research or your design systems thinking. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Is there any questions around any of that before I get started? Cool. Let me move this over here so I can see you guys. There we go. Okay. All right. You guys can see my screen. It should just be a full screen. Sweet. So I'm just going to start off by just kind of introducing myself and what I do and where I fit in UX design and product design. On me personally, just like in 3 seconds, my name is Taylor. So I love a lot of different kinds of things. I am an avid traveler. My girlfriend is from Peru, and I've been dating her for about 6 years. So I spend a lot of time in Peru with her. I love playing music. I play guitar for about 10 years now, actually. Time flies. This is me on a dinner date with Pasheen the cat. I was a soccer referee as well for about 10 years. And I have a little dog named Miko that growls at me when I come down the stairs. I make fun stuff, and I got into product design because of those fun things. So what I started off doing was I would program. So I was really into doing data visualization and programming and thinking about how data could potentially be used for like really experimental or unique things, such as putting on a VR headset and being able to fly around a city and see where people were tweeting at a specific time. Or making interactive visualizations work together in order to build really unique kind of interactive experiences. I've worked with companies such as the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, PBS, a lot of different companies that are dedicated more towards data experience, and I love building that in a fun kind of interactive way. And then what I do now is I make more serious stuff that can turn design prototypes into full business products for is it 95 of the top Fortune 100 companies that Splunk works on. Splunk at a nutshell just lets you take huge amounts of information, petabytes of potential data. You're able to take all that data and turn it from something that looks like this, which is large scale data, into something that is much more usable and useful for people, which looks like this. I like to equate my job to be something similar to if you have a blacksmith and you have the person who makes the hammer for the blacksmith that they can use to craft whatever they need. Splunk is kind of like that, and I'm kind of like that, where we build administrative experiences that lets companies like McLaren or Carnival Cruise Lines be able to build these beautiful visualizations that take large scale data over their entire process and build it in a way where they can actually see what's happening with their systems. And so it's very dynamic. A lot of the toolkit is based around understanding how to take very vague designs that anyone could potentially build in a specific way, kind of like if you were building a Photoshop, and making it something so that people can leverage it as a creative tool for their data. And so starting off kind of the conversation around the value prop and what is it that I think we should think about when we're doing design because when you're starting off as a designer, I think a large part of what you're told at the beginning level is you were really focused in on like the baseline, right? Which the baseline is your research ability. Do you know how to run a survey? Do you know the right kinds of questions to ask in an interview? Do you know design systems well enough to understand the patterns that you should build into? And all of that is very, very important to your process, so that you can take something, you can ideate around it, you can empathize with people, and you can turn that all into data that you can act upon, right? But a big part of that too, I think, is as a designer, I kind of came into it with that mindset in my first job and what I started out in. And I was humbled very quickly as a part of that process when something I did didn't turn out exactly the way I thought it did. And I'll give you kind of that structure and, what the project that I worked on, and how that project kind of changed my mindset as a designer to not just like my bubble of design. So I approached this project about, was like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And this was a rework of our Splunk documentation experience inside of Splunk. The challenge is that we have this giant enterprise system that you have potentially your dev documentation, you have things like Splunk Enterprise. We have all these different applications that could be part of Splunk Enterprise. What could a rework of our documentation experience look like as a part of Splunk Docs in Splunk Developer Portal? And so I went through this long, arduous process for almost 1.5 years, building out a structure for what I thought the system should look like, working with different project managers and engineers. And we did come up like with a design that we thought that we could eventually use and leverage as a part of our system. And so in enterprise, what you do is like, I went and I researched, I talked to the customers, I did the whole research life cycle of everything involved. I had a value prop of what I thought it should be, moving it away from kind of like this dictionary style experience where you just read basically like the equivalency I would give to Splunk's documentation is it's kind of like if you ask someone to make a cake and then they told you, here's the 7 types of flour you could use to make a cake, right? It's just kind of like reading a dictionary of different things you could do with it, but it's not actually like implementation of use case stories that people can actually be guided through to show the value of what the use case of what they can do is. But I built the structure out and I did everything that I did that I needed to do. 1.5 years passes, present everything to my PM, which is project manager, my engineers, and then I finished the project. And what we have is we have a thing called a 360, which is basically where they ask the people that you worked with, what did you think of Taylor? Or like, what did you think of this person you were working with, this designer? And I got into that process and I got the feedback back and they said, Taylor is amazing at user research. Taylor's amazing at his design system skills. I would never want to work with him. And you'd say like, well, why is that, right? And it's because I, as a designer, siloed myself away from anyone that needed to be a part of that process, to see that feedback, to validate and understand the same way that I went through all those design challenges. Those people who were like the project managers or engineers weren't really included as a part of that process. And as a result, it made it very difficult for them to see the value and how to build onto that structure of what they like the end goal of what I was trying to propose as a change to my design or to the design. And they didn't see really a path forward. So I proposed like this massive change to the system. There was no step 1, step 2, step 3 to get there. And by the end of the entire process, this was something that eventually just kind of fell away because it had none of the project manager support. None of the project managers wanted to work on it because they didn't see their feedback added to it. And none of the engineers felt that it was feasible because they hadn't had conversations with me on some of the challenges they might have in order to implement the process. So although it was a great UX, I was probably most proud of this in terms of my UX output in terms of a strict process that I was following. It didn't actually get into development and it wasn't actually applicable to what we wanted to build. And so you ask yourself that question as a designer, like, what is a designer supposed to do? And my answer to that changed from my goal as a designer is to be a user advocate to my goal is to be a user advocate, but my main job as a designer is to be a leader who can build artifacts that people can have discussion around in conversation. If you don't have that conversation with project management and with the engineers, they won't be invested in you, and therefore they won't want to build the structure. So I think what I want to get across as we go into like the value proposition and things like that in the next step is, how can we start segmenting that off so that how would you talk to someone like a project manager in the future? How would you talk to someone who's more business oriented or business focused versus how would you talk to an engineer different? How would you talk to another designer, right? And I think that's a big part of our discussion is trying to figure out what that looks like. And the framework that I use most often in my work and more subconsciously in the back of my mind when I'm presenting to different people is something called the 9-block or the business model canvas. This comes from the business world, and I'll break this down as like what I see in it as a designer. The 9-block or business model canvas is what I use for things that I've built like on personal project times of like, if I was to start a business, what are the main things that I need to be successful in that need to be there in the business to be successful? But it also helps me break it apart to say, what are the core tenets of a business and what are some of like your operations people probably thinking about? What are some marketing people probably thinking about? And what are your project managers potentially thinking about? And where is that crossover with what I do to make sure that if I'm presenting an idea to a stakeholder like a project manager, I can talk the same language of what they want to hear so that I can get their buy-in to actually build the product. Does this make sense so far? Is there any questions up to this point? Just giving a minute. Cool. So I'll describe what the 9-block is, but each of these individual components are what fold into what is the value you provide for your customer. A value proposition is kind of what the end goal of anything that you've done UX wise, like what is the final output of your UX, like your research, and then what value you're adding to your customer. It's pretty much that is the value proposition. In addition to anything like the values you see from your partners, what your partners are providing, anything that's like your cost structure that sets you apart as a differentiator from your competitor, all of that can be rolled into the value that makes you a little bit different. I have one that's an example of Spotify, but you can roll this into anything from a startup to a Series D to an entire like enterprise level organization. Spotify, in the example, like their value prop, you could think of things like free music pretty much for anyone at any time, great partnerships that are available for getting people in front of your music for creators. Things like that could be differentiators in your value in your business that you're providing. And we'll go into each of these to show what each of them mean, like what is a key partner, what is a key activity and resource, and where does that fit? Normally, let's say is anything on the left side here is like your operations. So more of a developer engineer perspective on how do we get things done. The right is more of your UX or your design focus, which is who are the people we're targeting? What is the relationship we have with them? Like how do they access us to get what they need? And where do they access us in their process? And then at the bottom is more your business focus of, how do you make something profitable? What is the, if I'm expending X amount in marketing versus the revenue that I'm getting is X amount, where can I look for those revenue streams in my design value that can then feed into the value prop that people will actually like wanting to spend money on whatever thing I'm building is. Walking through examples of that, we'll walk through each of these 9 ones, but the first we'll just do the operations. So first is partnerships. This is anything that you could think of that's like your external companies or suppliers or collaborators that support your business. In my case, it would be something like because I work in the tech space, it would be, we maybe leverage an API, right? That's from Google or like AWS or something along those lines. And because of what we leverage as a part of our API, if I get a question, say from a developer that says, well, we can't do this, right? Because this maybe takes too much time for me to develop. Part of the conversation would be reframing that to say, oh, I know you use, like, as an example, D3, which is like a visualization library on our back end, right? Could we leverage a partnership like that to make it a little easier on the developers so they can get implementation faster so that we're not behind on our delivery? It could be other things, and it could be more physical, right? So if you're building something like a kiosk in an airport, that could be like a sensor manufacturer maybe needed in order to build the sensor. So if someone walks by, then it would highlight and pop it up to say like, hey, I see you're walking by. This draws your attention so that you're actually accessing it, right? And when we think about that from the design perspective, it's more along the lines of, this partnership maybe costs X amount of money, but the value add to a customer is this. And because of that value add, I think we can justify that partnership being added to our process. Next one, key activities. Let's see what time if it's done. Okay. Next one is key, or sorry, did I just do key activities? There we go. Key activities. So, you could think of this in terms of, what are you actually doing as a part of your day-to-day business operations, or what are they doing as part of the day-to-day business operations that you can design into that would maybe provide a value add to your customer? So think of it like doing software updates to change the process of your business. As an example, Splunk sometimes does on-premise, which means it's a specific server built at the location of our customer. And because it's built at the location, an update is much harder to get something to than something like a cloud platform, right? And so because of that change, being aware of that as a designer can like potentially change your approach to recommending a design if it takes longer for some customers over other customers. You can also think of it less of a specific like activity as a physical thing, and a process and more as a process. So a cruise company, like Carnival or any of those, what they do is they maybe take their food usage. They, take however X amount of food that they bring onto a cruise ship every month. They could take that and then, using the statistics from that as an internal activity, try to figure out the margins on that so that they could maybe cut the amount that they're doing, or the amount that they're bringing in, or use it and when they cut that either cut costs, or they can bring higher quality food into the process, which again raises customer satisfaction, which then again could make them where maybe they can charge more for their product. Key resources, again, still in operations land, is anything that you have that's that may be like a physical thing that puts you at a competitive advantage over other people. If you've ever watched something like Shark Tank's an example of this, where you'll hear them all the time, like, well, have you IP'd this? Or, do you have something that like you've patented that maybe sets you apart? In programming world or the developer world, that typically can be, you can patent code. Some design systems or design language is harder to patent, but you can do something similar to it. It's just harder to enforce. Your human capital, which is the people that work for you, maybe they come with a different perspective because they work for your company over other people. Financial assets, infrastructure. The way I like think of it is like FedEx using some proprietary IP for tracking and analyzing their delivery schedule. And again, what I want to get across here is, as a designer, it's not asking you to understand everything about this. It's when you're talking to an engineer and they're saying like, here's what we can do and what we can't do, then you can have that conversation with them to understand like, hey, I know we can't potentially do this, but I know that maybe we have this proprietary thing that we're potentially leveraging here. Should we be using that proprietary thing if it's going to make the design harder in the future, or should we leverage more of an open source thing like this? Like what's your opinion on that? And you let them guide the conversation then, but you're able to kind of guide that piece when you're working with them. Examples of like, and again, like this is more the getting into the UX kind of specific stuff, but just because you have all of the operations really working well doesn't mean that that value isn't going to inherently be better necessarily just because like you have good key activities or key partnerships. Examples of that would be something like the Ponyo player. This was something that was developed by Neil Young, I think like in 2008. And the whole premise of this and the design and the activities and the partnerships they did was around audio quality. And so they wanted to make this player that was so effective at playing like lossless music that they would sacrifice anything else of their activities in order to reach that goal. And when you ask a customer and they said like, what do you value? And they say, well, you know, like, how much do you value lossless music? People would just be like, I value lossless music, right? Everyone values lossless music. But if you actually test it with people, then the reality is that perceived value of lossless music, of what people say they value, really isn't that high to what it actually is. And as a result, when they actually released the product, it failed spectacularly because people couldn't really tell the difference in sound quality from this versus an Apple iPod, right? Which had been on the market for years and years. It wasn't enough of a differentiator. But they built their activities around lossless music. They built their partnerships around lossless music, and it didn't provide any, it did provide a value to the value prop, but it wasn't enough to be something that would be like a differentiator for their company. Getting into like, this is more the design specific side, that right side of the map. You have more of what would be like our UX work. It's understanding your customer segment, right? So based off the age and behavior, the user research that you do to understand the person, you can understand like, is it business to business, business to consumer? All of that's our wheelhouse. I won't explain too much to this because that's the entire point of IterateUX. I'm pretty sure you've been in many conversations like this, but examples of that applied would be if you could analyze age, location, experience of people in Udemy, and then have it recommend more effective coursework, right? You're taking whatever the customer base is, and based on the complexity of that customer base can affect the value prop as well. So what I mean by that is if you're targeting let's say you're targeting a to-do app, like you're building a to-do app, that customer segment is going to be so wide and there's so much competition within that customer segment base around what you're doing. That's going to be a much harder sell for the user. You're going to have a much higher perceived value that you're going to have to provide for your customer over something that say like maybe you have a very specialized sensor device for washing machines, right? That very few are in the competitive space, that very few in that customer segment are going to be have competition with, because that customer segment is so much smaller and so much more niche. You can target that, and it could be the perceived value is much higher because there's less competition in the space to compete with. You could still be what's the word, disrupted from a competitor, but because it's so much smaller and the space is so much smaller, you can potentially charge more, or that customer's segment is much more focused in what you're trying to deliver. Customer relationships. Customer relationships are and all this is in Business Canvas. If you want to research it, Business Model Canvas is what it's called. This is what I used whenever I present my material. I kind of break it up into those 3 buckets of operations, design, and then cost and revenue, and then how that relates to the value prop, so that if I'm presenting to a material for all 3 groups of people, it kind of shows all of this. Customer relationship, that's how you give like, what is the relationship with the customer and how they access your product? Is it transactional, like a kiosk somewhere? So if you're, again, the kiosk at the airport, that's a transactional one. A self-service one where if something goes wrong, they can troubleshoot it themselves. Or is it something that's more like personal assistance where you have someone on the other end that can actually respond or do the process, like if you were calling a phone company to change your number. The Amazon order self-service kind of thing that everyone probably is aware of is a good example of that. And then the final one is like example is for design, more the design focus is channels. So how do you actually deliver that product and how they access it? So like the web, your applications, developer APIs, if it's a physical device, something like a storefront. Ferrari is an example of like a really interesting case with channels, primarily because when you go to a Ferrari dealership, it's like a special event that they try to push on you. And you can't actually buy like the newer vehicles, you have to buy the used vehicles. And so their way they build their channels is kind of like an exclusive club, right? And because it's that exclusivity of the channel, they charge more for whatever the price of the product is that they're trying to sell over something like a Ford or something like that, even though it costs them about the same to make as a Ford, technically they can charge a lot more because of the brand recognition and the exclusivity that they build around that brand in their channel. And the last one, I was go over these two quickly. And again, all of these affect and they fill in that blank of the business of the value prop is the cost and revenue stream. So cost and revenue stream, cost is what it sounds like. It's your labor, your upkeep. If you're doing R&D to continue development on whatever the product is that you're building, or the marketing that you're actually applying to sell it. Some interesting like facts. And again, if you look at something like a Tesla, they only spend like around $151,000 for their marketing. Everything that they try to do is like this word of mouth experience that they can use to sell their product line, versus Ford, which I think from online, they said they average around 1.98 billion in marketing. So the way you can frame your marketing, the way you set up your R&D to cut expenses, a big part of this more in the design world is you can say something like, internally, we see that our customers potentially are leveraging, you're using like this API to make a call or do something like that on your back end. But here, what if we change the design in this specific way so that they don't have to do that self-service experience here because it's like internal to the product? Therefore, there's less calls, which means less money that you're spending on like your Google Cloud platform, which cuts the expense down, right? So you're what I'm saying there is you're able to say it's a cost-cutting measure because you're looking at the internal way a system is built. You're cutting and saying, if I can eliminate, say, like the calls that you're making here to the back end, that could save X amount of dollars. And then that could be both a benefit to the PM and engineering organization to make the change along with your user improvement, right? So it's like it's framing the way you're thinking about the problem to the different people, right? And what they might want to hear in order to make the validation and make them value the change beyond just what the user sees at the end. And then the last one is like revenue. So it's like your advertising, subscription contracts, and sales. It's an interesting example of that and like value prop is some companies, what they do, like Amazon, is they prop themselves up where they have a huge diversification towards their logistics systems. And their value and the way their value prop is correlated is they are okay with taking losses on new ventures to get market share over other competitors. And so what they will do is they will take more costs than revenue in smaller business model canvases that are dedicated to like a particular area, like their music or, Prime. They may take losses in Prime and their Prime subscriptions, whatever it may be that they're into. They'll take those losses, but they'll fund that with the primary revenue that they're getting from things like their AWS services or their storefront. And so that's how they continue to build market share, is they look into these these places, they outpace small mom and pop shops because they look at it as like, oh, we can just outcompete with them for however X amount of time. They can't support it. And then Amazon then owns that space because then they've outcompeted them because they're self-funding the project area that they're building into. Taking that all together and just like building that into a model canvas. This is an example of like Spotify's business model canvas. I grabbed this from online, so this isn't mine, just being clear. This is an example where you can look at each of these different areas and kind of see how they fit in, right? So your key partners being your open source developers who may be contributing with you, your advertisements, anything like Sony, which like automatically has an API that imports it into Sony PlayStation so they can actually leverage it while they play games. All those partnerships are useful. Anything like the resources from their music library. User data is a great key resource because they can leverage that user data in order to make more informed decisions. And then what you're seeing is all those like individual pieces then fit into the value prop overall, right? Which is like your social sharing, which could be fitted into that Sony PlayStation category, collaborative playlists, active to 50 million songs, was it the offline downloads could be a part of the key activity of database and graphing. All of those decisions that are kind of like the operations side, as well as what they're learning from the UX of the customer segment, can be fitted together into what that value prop actually provides for the customer. Is there any questions about like the business model canvas before I keep moving on?
I think we have two questions. Do you want to go now or further later? Yeah, I can repeat the question if you want. Should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the first question was, I wonder when you create this 9 block in the image here, is this more about the workshop conversation with the team or how it is coming out for each block?
So this isn't necessarily part of this. I think it's not really related to necessarily the workshop in particular. I think part of this is framing it too as when you start your conversation around, I'd say past the ideation phase, or when you start ideating around your solutions, think of the solution that you're ideating around and think of it in like terms of these blocks, right? So if I'm thinking about it and I've done my research, then we can start filling out what that customer segment might look like. If we've done some of the work on, I don't know what you're building. Let's say it's a pet adoption app or something like that, right? The pet adoption app, you could think of like, what are the key partners that you could potentially partner with that maybe you partner with Chewy or whatever that might be. Like where could you look to diversify that so that you could cut costs as a component of that, right? As a starting point, like where do you get that brand recognition to like, build your process? Key activities, right? Or key resources. You'd think, well, I need a database for this. What would be included in that database of the things that we want to collect? How could we analyze that data that could potentially fit into that value prop of what we're providing for that process? And so when you then go and you bring that conversation to someone like you would normally bring it to an angel investor or someone you're presenting this idea if you're working internally to a company and they're more the business perspective, you can speak to that and you can say, we did the research here, here's the activity of things that we could do, here's how that would eventually cut down on your cost structure, and here's how that value then adds to your company.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the second, oh, sorry, continue.
No, I just said hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. I heard someone speaking. Is anyone have any questions? Okay. So the second question was how luxury brands buy in customer loyalty.
So I think like actually it'll be there's a future slide I have here, but let me figure out. I have like 7% battery. If it starts to die, I will switch over here. But So luxury brands are really, really interesting because this is more into marketing. Like, to be clear, this is from a YouTuber named IterateUX that I watch. So this was more in the marketing perspective he comes from. He was a marketing manager at NVIDIA. But the marketing side for this views it in this kind of way, which is like your three-line approach, which is you have your cost that you provide, you have your price that you sell it for, and then your perceived value of whatever a person perceives what it should be, right? So what you'll start to see is price to cost is your margin of what you'll get basically from the selling the product. But price to perceived value is very interesting because perceived value is, you don't want these to cross, by the way. Perceived value is just like what you would expect, what they want. You could, if these are very far apart, like say that's like the market segment that you would want to pull into. What I mean by that is like a Ford would have cost and price pretty close together, and they would sacrifice the margin that they would make, and they would have that perceived value be more because they want that market segment to be more controlled by them. A brand like Ferrari or Gucci or anything like that, I keep pressing the keyboard in an accident. A brand like that, what they're going to want is they would put the price to perceived value very close to it. And what their whole marketing gimmick is they want to always move that perceived value up, right? And they may do things like, if you look at H&M or some of these companies, they will literally burn their clothes over having excess inventory, because they are so ingrained that they need the value of whatever that product is, that any excess inventory would be a detriment to them. And Ferrari is like that too. Like I said, if you go into a Ferrari dealership, they'll try to sell you a used car. They will tell you no to buying a new car. You have to have a brand loyalty. I think it's kind of stupid, but it's kind of like you have to have a brand loyalty that you've built up with the company, previously. And then that raises that perceived value. And by perceived value, I'm not just talking about like marketing gimmicks. For us as designers, it's the actual features potentially that we build into the product that raise that value as well. It may be perceived, but the interesting about perceived value is also you're quantifying whatever that perception might be for different people, right? So what I mean by that is if I have one user who I talk to and they say, like, again, like that lossless example I gave earlier, the perceived value, like it was considered a value add for people, but the perception of what versus what the reality is on making that purchasing decision in the end is much higher probably for them, much lower for them than what it would actually provide. So if I'm talking to a project manager and they say, well, we need X feature, right, to be added to the product, all right, what I can do is I can quantify that and say, based off of what we've had, here are the top features that we had that could increase the perceived value the most for our customer. I hope that makes sense. Cool. Time are we at? We're 9:20 for me. Okay. Some other examples of how those like influence and impact each other, if you're thinking about it in terms of something like Twitter, right? Or X now, I guess is what they call it. But Twitter, when something happens to one of those 9 blocks that we talk about, and you think about this as a designer, you can start seeing the impact on how it affects other parts of the system. So as an example, there was a change that was made on Twitter, I think like a couple months ago, like in June, that was that rate limit that prevents a user from only viewing 300, I think, tweets a day, was the limit. And the answer they gave to that was a programmatic problem that they said, like, well, based on our partnership with Google, there's currently a huge number of bots using the system. Because there's a huge number of bots using the system, it infinitely scrolls or whatever, and we lose a lot of money because of that, right? I don't think that's what it is. I think it's more that they just didn't pay their Google Cloud bill, if I'm honest, on what they needed. But the problem that you run into with that is that's a knock-on effect where they make a change to the key partnership, and they say, well, because of that change, only 300 people can view 300 posts can be viewed a day. What are a part of posts? Advertisements. So if you kill the ability of infinite scroll, you kill the ability of them to continue to show advertisements as on the scrolling platform. That has a knock-on effect on both UX, which prevents it from, being able to be, you lose the users because they physically can't use the product anymore. And then the secondary knock-on effect is your revenue source is then diminished again, because maybe in your contract you say that you need to show X amount of ads per, however many number of users, or have a certain click-through rate. And now you can't do that anymore because you physically limited the user from being able to do that. And that's on top of anything like ads already kind of leaving the platform already, which is like an impact to the business. So there's things like that. You can start seeing knock-on patterns, and when you're thinking about those 9 blocks, if something makes a change over here and a developer tells you something like, well, we can't do this for XYZ reasons, you can justify it in a multitude of ways, from both like the programmatic perspective, the business perspective, and then your perspective as a designer. Going on again, kind of talking about that perceived value. I'm going to stop here in a minute and leave it open for questions. But let me go ahead. I'll skip ahead here. Another point I just wanted to make, like walking through this, was when you have those conversations on value add and delivery, you'll oftentimes, when you're actually in the workforce, it'll be a conversation of, we can't do, like, I know that's the optimal UX experience, but we can't physically do that for XYZ reasons. And our goal as designers, when we get into those conversations, is to make it not like what I did when I was doing the developer experience, where it was kind of like, it doesn't hit value until you've built everything. We want it to be more like, here's step 1 that you can do that'll initially get our customer through the door. Here's step 2 that we can provide. That's another value add that will make the experience better, and et cetera, till they get to the point where they can actually use the product effectively. If you build something like this, engineers and PMs will like immediately shut down on you. That's my experience personally, is they will not want to build it. Because they need to be able to hit like a criteria. Like if you're coming from the PM perspective, the project manager, they are told you have to deliver by X date in it's quarter 2 of 2024, right? And your engineer will say, there's no way I can hit that at that time frame. You have to be able to have compromise and negotiate with them while still advocating for the best UX experience that you can give. So what I recommend too is, like, when you're in presentations, like a good challenge is to have someone try to poke holes in you, to say, like, this is an example dashboard that we built, is to say, well, we can't do anomaly detection here because it's going to take a significant portion of time. What would be your approach on like what we could do here? And you could maybe like say, well, you could scale it down in this particular way where we only focus on this part first. We could potentially just show, like, do we think room temperature is like important, or like power utilization? How much do we value that add here versus the time commitment for engineering? And let them, have that conversation, but lead that conversation with that, to say, I don't know what your timetable is on this. What do you think it would take for you to do anomaly detection like this? And see if what pushback they give you, so that they're leading the conversation and then you're integrating the feedback. And I think, like, what I learned, like, when I was a designer, like, I always looked at like PMs and engineers kind of like this. When I started out, they would give me feedback and I would just sit there. I'd be like, cool, thanks, bro. Right? Like, it's great. That's great. Can we just build the thing that people want? And we kind of have this hubris as designers, I think, of like, because we are designers, we're the ones with the final say so in the product. And we know what customers want because we've interviewed the customers. And yes, the customers are important, But the reality is you don't win friends that way, and you don't become a leader that way. You become a leader by including people's feedback and finding ways to make everyone feel like they're collaborating towards that vision. It's called the IKEA effect as an example. IKEA effect is the IKEA doesn't just build the thing for you. They give the components and make you feel like you're a part of the design process by making you build and pick the pieces, and then you build it, and then you feel accomplished because you're a part of the process. And because they feel a part of the process, they're going to be advocates for you and not detractors from you. I'll stop here because I want to leave time for questions. But the last example I had here was like to give yourself a challenge is to look at your design and say, if a design, this was a design I made a while back on our mobile app, and if a engineer comes to you and says, well, we can't do this because the call, like we have 3 API calls that we need to make, right? So we have a call for the number of alerts that would need to be made, and that could fail. The critical major minor could potentially fail, or like the incident ID could fail. What do we do here? Do we, like, if one of them fails, do we fail everything for the card? Or do we have like specialized failure states for each of these components? Like what would you recommend? Or, like you have organization incidents here, like that could take a significant amount of time for it to actually load that information in. So if there's like thousands of that, how should we handle that? Should we just prevent everything on the screen from loading at once? Or should we, like have like a small little loading skeleton or something like that just for that one part? And you let the engineers like just pretend to be kind of in that mindset so that you can be made aware of that. And when you get better at design, you can have those answers maybe already prepared for them when they start asking those questions. Cool. I can leave it open for questions now. I know I ran a little bit over more time than I would like to for this, but I'd like to answer questions too, if we could stay like 5 minutes over. I promise I don't bite. Oh, let's see here. Question, inner differing or adding strategy. Like any differing or added strategy on presenting UX recommendations to stakeholders. I think it's not saying UX recommendations you just like throw them by the wayside, but what I'm saying is depending on your audience, you tailor your conversation based on the audience that you're presenting to, is like what I'm trying to get across. If it's an engineer, my comments are going to be much more along the lines of, hey, I built 3 different ideas here. I tested, like, what do you think of the technical feasibility of what I could do with like this part over here, right? If I can't do that, could we potentially think about like, I know it's not the best experience, but could we do something like this as like a secondary option, right? For PM, it would be more along the lines of, yeah, if you're delivering something, do you think this is right for your timetable on what you actually need to deliver here? Do you agree with like the pattern that I'm showing here as far as what you've heard from customer interviews and things like that, right? Any more questions?
Feel free to text here in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself if you have any question.
I promise I don't bite.
Mhm. Yeah, so we have a follow-up question for this. Is there any framework where having a conversation with the engineer to let people buy in a short time?
I mean, I rely on the 9 block as my main thing, but like for, are you asking more along the lines of if I have a short, like by short time, are you meaning like we need to deliver this like tomorrow, or like in the conversation we have to make a decision around this?
Yes.
If it's
Like,
more like, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Like I was saying, that person is saying yes.
Um, I don't have a framework in particular, but what I do like normally is, if it's like very, very short timetable and we need to like drive a decision making around that, um, I'll try to find a good compromise based on their recommendation as well on what we can provide. So it may not be the best UX experience to start with. But what I try to do is I try to pick my battles, right? So um, I think of trust as kind of like a bar you have like in a game, but it's kind of like if you work with someone and you always tell them no to their ideas, then when you actually need to tell them no, they may not value your opinion as much because you've never included their feedback as a part of the process. So if it's small things, like an example of a small thing would be like, you know, could we change the text color? I would consider small things like UI, like kind of things, or it's like, could we change the color here or the font or something like that, or in this particular way? It may not be their area, but it's like, would that make it easier? Or could I eliminate this small thing like maybe the tag isn't as important there, or we can't access that tag very easily? I would say, well, here's XYZ reasons that's going to maybe cause issues down the line, but we can build it. And then if a customer comes back and says, hey, we really need that, then it's validated against customer feedback versus just me saying it. And then if it becomes something big or major, so like as an example I've had with PMs before, where it's like almost like we want it's a node editor I'm working on right now, but it's like we want that entire node editor experience to be this GitHub style experience, right? Where everything can be edited at the same time with other individuals. And the answer for me was I did not see customers doing that at all, where they would collaborate at the same time on the node diagrams that they were building. So it'd be a huge engineering investment. And I said, I could put my foot down at that time with PM and engineering, because I said, I don't really think that's a great idea. I think we should validate that, because they had my trust from me including their feedback through the rest of their process.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, I think we have. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think there is one question. Do you have any additional strategies like mid-project check to help yourself foresee the possible difficulties affecting the success of a current project?
Yeah. So to that point, I think like to the point above too, I think what I do is I set up a weekly engineering review of my designs. So I always I think we have a tendency to silo ourselves off and want it to be perfect before showing it to people. I highly not recommend not doing that. So like in my case, I always pretty much anytime I have a new idea or just like a new design, I immediately show it to the developers and to the engineers. Even if I don't I'm saying like, here's the direction I'm kind of thinking of. What do what's your opinion on this? And so the idea is to have them always be a part of the design process. And most people don't care about, I want to be careful, like maybe not don't care is the wrong word, but most people want feedback to be heard, not necessarily implemented. If you make sure that your engineers are in the same room and they can provide the feedback to you, and you can justify like what their direction is, and maybe not justify, but just like hear what they say and say, that's a great question. Let me bring this up with like a customer, right? Or something like that in an interview. And then they feel like their process has been included. If you don't go with that direction, they will most of the times be perfectly fine. there's sometimes where I have gone with what the engineers have wanted to say, but so long as they feel like they've been heard, their feedback has been taken into account, and they're always included as a part of that to recommend their own ideas and their own directions, that can build a very healthy relationship where they feel included and they're not just going to be brought in at the end. It's going to be tossed over the wall and they say, well, I never told you that we have to make 8 API calls like this, and this is going to take 4 weeks or, like 6 weeks. Yeah, I think that's the problem with most designers is they just lock their ideas until the end. And I think the better designer you are, the more collaborative you are. I also do engineering design, design office hours. So I have office hours every week that anyone can come in and provide a design. And I may not have the right answer for it. That's perfectly fine. It's more they can come in, surface things to me, and then once they surface things to me, then I can provide that feedback.
Yeah, I think office hours seems exciting. Yeah. So yeah, I think we are almost wrapping up with the questions. If anyone have, feel free to like having in the chat. So I think thank you, Taylor, for your amazing insights. We cannot wait for more insights like this. So what I've learned today was that the design impact goes far beyond that than just the pixels and aesthetics, right? It's about conveying the value, fostering the collaborations, and building a bridge between innovation and understanding, right?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do we have questions? Yeah, no.
If you guys have more questions outside, I'm on Discord. It's Kiwi Taylor.
yeah.
Yeah,
Feel
I
free to
think
ask
we are
questions on
signing off.
Discord channel.
Yeah. I'll be sharing Taylor's LinkedIn as well and Discord channel as well in the chat.
Nice. Thank you so much, Taylor. It was very informative. Like usually UXers think about like let's after after research and things like that, what all things we can define, like persona, journey maps and things like that. But like before that, we do have some things which is very important as a value proposition. Like usually people don't consider. So this is very important to know that like how to do, what to do, what all things to consider, and how it will help the collaborations with which stakeholders and things like that, which is very, very exciting. Great, great. Thank you so much for sharing all these like very important information. Like we should consider as a UXer for sure. Great. Nice, nice. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so thanks everyone. See you on this Thursday event. And yep, enjoy. Have a nice evening. Have a good day. Have a good night. And yep, keep in touch.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Taylor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
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 Hey everyone, on behalf of IterateUX, we'd like to thank you so much for watching this week's event. If you like the content, please leave a like and subscribe. We'll have events every Thursday at 5:30 Pacific Time. Join our Discord in the description to find out more.